I moved to the city the way people climb out of rivers, wet, breathless, and half convinced the current would pull me back in. New lease, new routes to memorize, new coffee shop with the too-loud grinder where I pretended to be the kind of person who reads before work. I'd taken a program manager role at a nonprofit that liked to describe itself as quietly ambitious. I liked that. Quiet felt like a luxury after years of family noise. My first morning, I wore the kind of blazer that says I am here to be competent, not dazzling, and got to the office early enough to meet the fluorescent lights before they fully forgave the darkness. The building wasn't fancy, concrete bones, glass conference rooms, carpets that still remembered the last tenants, but it had the energy of people who wanted to make things better in ways you could actually measure. I let myself enjoy that small relief. There's a particular calm at 8:30, when laptops thrum like insects, and no one has chosen a tone for the day yet. I found the room for the weekly operations stand-up, a glass rectangle with a view of the courtyard, and a ficus that had given up on looking cheerful. I checked the agenda, inhaled, and told myself that whatever I used to be belonged to cities with different skylines. Then he walked in. It didn't happen like in movies, with a guitar strum and a zoom. It was simpler and far worse. My body recognized him before my head remembered why. The tall, quiet posture that used to soften a room. The pause before he spoke, as if words deserved to be chosen. Jason, 10 years older, a little narrower at the jaw, a few threads of silver near his temples that made everything about him seem inevitable. Head of operations, said the email I'd half-read when I accepted the job. I'd filed the name under administrative blur, a list of titles that would eventually have faces. Now the face had a history that pressed every breath I'd just learned to take. He saw me and stopped without making a scene of the stopping. For a second, something flickered, genuine surprise, then a thinning of the eyes that looked like memory moving furniture in a hurry. He smiled the way professionals smile when rooms are full of witnesses. He said welcome like you say it to a new colleague who matters. It was the same voice he used to have when he said goodnight from my parents' porch, back when I still believed in tidy endings. I do not know how I got through that first meeting. I remember charts and a joke about a grant portal that crashes exactly when the deadline approaches. I remember the way he deferred to the program leads, the way he heard before he fixed, the way his attention made you want to offer him your best instead of your resume. The calm had always been part of it, the still center of him where I had once, disastrously, tried to live. If this was supposed to be a sign from the universe, it felt like one of those riddles you don't realize you've misread until the door locks behind you. 10 years ago, I'd stood in a badly lit kitchen after one of those family dinners that start with politeness and end with accusations, and told my sister's fiancé that if he weren't with her, I thought I would love him. I'd been drunk on cheap sangria and something far older than wine. I hadn't expected a reward for my honesty, only relief. Instead, he'd looked relieved, too, which felt like stealing oxygen out of a room someone else had paid for. The wedding was called off a week later. He moved out of state. My sister, Maya, stopped speaking to me with a silence that could have frozen oceans. Our mother told anyone who would listen that I had hexed the marriage, which, for once, wasn't even the most unhinged thing she said that year. I did what people do when they are both the story and the villain. I left. New apartments, new excuses, new cities with coffee shops that did not know my name. I taught myself that regret can be domesticated if you feed it routines and deny it any sunlight. And now, a decade later, I had found a job that felt like usefulness and walked straight into the old room, unaired and perfectly preserved, where the past still smelled like something had rotted. We kept it professional, almost aggressively so. He sent me the onboarding packet and introduced me to the finance director, who never lost his temper, even when numbers behaved like cats. He sat across from me in meetings without looking like he was sitting across from me. I laughed at a coworker's story about a donor who wanted nomming rights on a supply closet and heard my own laugh for the first time in months. If the room was shrinking, we both pretended not to notice. Still, patterns betray us. I avoided the hallway outside his office at first, then made a point of using it, just to prove to myself I could. He didn't hover. He didn't ask about Maya. He didn't remind me that there had been a ring and a date and a dress that would never be worn. He gave me a project that mattered, not the safe, softball tasks you give to someone you owe a debt or a warning. He made room for me, and I did the only thing that felt honest. I filled it. People liked to say he was quiet. They mistook quiet for absence. I remembered the way his quiet used to be, more like a porch light than a blackout. That part hadn't changed. When he thanked me after my first site visit for not coming back with tidy answers, only better questions, I wanted to ask if he remembered the kitchen, the confession, the choir of consequences we never learned how to sing through. I wanted to ask if relief ever felt like its own punishment. I said, "You're welcome." I wrote my notes. I kept moving, but the room between us kept vibrating. Once, in the break room, I reached for a mug at the same time he did, and his hand brushed mine. The contact was so simple it should have meant nothing. It didn't. My skin told me, in a language older than decisions, that memory isn't just a mental file. It's a body returning to a temperature it knows. That night, sleep tried to bargain with me. It offered me a slideshow of everything that had followed my confession. Maya's eyes splintering when she said she didn't know who I was anymore. My mother's voice declaring me cursed. My father cleaning a pot after everyone left because men in our family prefer doing to judging. I watched every frame. I told myself the things survivors say, that what happened was not entirely my fault, that the wedding had cracked long before I put my hand on the fracture, that truth told badly is still truth. None of that made the old ache less precise. It made it livable. The nonprofit did what nonprofits do in the spring. It bloomed logistics, community partners, a gala whose theme tried to be both aspirational and unembarrassing, an audit that wanted 50 answers to the same question. I learned the new language quickly. I earned trust by showing my work and never pretending to have magic. The team taught me their shorthand and their snacks. I remembered how it felt to be good at a thing that didn't require anyone else's heart. I let the competence steady my hands. And then Jason asked if we could talk. He did it in the hallway near the storage closet, at the end of a day that had been 50 emails long. He didn't lower his voice into the register men use when they want privacy without permission. He just said my name in a way that didn't ask me to pretend we were strangers. He said he'd like to find a time, outside of meetings, away from agendas, to acknowledge history, and to set whatever boundaries we both needed to do our jobs without turning every shared space into a test we had to fail publicly. It wasn't seduction. It was an adult offering an adult the dignity of not pretending the past was a rumor. I said yes, and meant it. We picked a time after work, in a nondescript corner of a very ordinary cafe, where the barista spelled my name wrong in a new way that felt like a fresh start. Before that conversation, I did what I always do when control feels fragile. I cleaned. It's embarrassing how many answers the right cloth can pretend to hold. I wiped my kitchen counters. I rearranged the spices I use twice a month. I found a jar of cumin older than some friendships and threw it away with a flourish that would have been funny if anyone had been there to see it. The apartment looked like readiness. Inside, I was a crowded airport. I didn't plan what to say. Planning had never saved me from my mouth. 10 years ago, it had delivered a sentence that changed the direction of 4 lives. This time, I decided to be precise with nouns and stingy with adjectives. I would say I was sorry for the harm, not for the truth. I would not ask him about the years in between unless he offered them. I would not make myself small to make him comfortable. I would not make myself grand to prove I had healed. At 5:30, I took a bus 2 stops in the wrong direction, realized it, laughed out loud, and walked the remaining 12 minutes because movement was the only rhythm that made sense. The sky had that washed-out quality spring sometimes wears when it's tired of being earnest. The air smelled like rain that hadn't committed yet. He was already there, jacket off, hands around a mug like he needed the warmth for purposes other than temperature. He stood to greet me, and then seemed to reconsider the choreography, landing on a nod that felt like the only true thing in a room with laminate tables and a tip jar labeled college fund for our espresso machine. We sat. The hum of the cafe arranged itself around us. A woman at the window typed with the intensity of someone sending herself out of a relationship. A man behind us tried to convince a client that authenticity was a strategy. The espresso machine screamed at intervals, as if punctuation had been outsourced. He did not begin with the night in the kitchen. He began with my work, what he'd noticed, what he respected, what he hoped for the projects I was shepherding. It wasn't a detour, it was context. He wanted me to know that this conversation wasn't a way to smuggle the past into a decision about a budget. It was its own thing, and the work would remain the work. Then he said the thing I had half feared and half hoped, that when I spoke that sentence a decade ago, it hadn't broken something that was whole. It had revealed a break he hadn't allowed himself to see. He said he should have handled it differently, that disappearing had been the coward's version of integrity, that he had hurt Maya in ways that belonged to him, not to me. He didn't audition for absolution. He described his accountability the way you describe a scar, without romance and without shame. I listened, not like a judge, like someone who has learned what listening is for. When he paused, I told him I was sorry for the harm. I told him I didn't regret being honest, even if honesty had been a match in a room full of gas. I told him I had spent years convincing myself that I had only ruined one life when the truth was that we each had ruined our own for a while. And then, to our credit, tried to rebuild with materials that didn't burn so easily. He smiled at that. Not happy, not sad, something in the middle that people who work in complicated systems wear when they find a sentence that fits. He said he hadn't known if seeing me would feel like a trapdoor. It didn't. It felt, he said, like a room he should have aired out years ago. We sat in that room together, finally, with the windows open. When we stood to leave, we did not hug. We did not make promises. We agreed to be colleagues who knew a secret and carried it like grown-ups, carefully, without using it as currency. Outside, the sky had finally decided to rain. We walked 2 blocks under the same awning, then turned in different directions with a wave that felt like a bow to a shared past. Nothing more. I went home and made a simple dinner and ate it at a table that didn't require an audience. Sleep came easier that night, as if the old story had been folded neatly and put away in a drawer that still existed, but no longer lived in the middle of the room. In the morning, the city was cleaner in that temporary way rain grants. I put on the blazer that had learned my shape, took the train, climbed the stairs, and walked back into a building where the ficus looked marginally more hopeful. At my desk, there was a sticky note with a case number for a small grant we'd been chasing and a line in a neat hand. Approved. Nice work. No signature. It didn't need one. I sat down, opened my laptop, and started the day. The room we had never aired out was open now, windows letting in weather I could live with. I didn't know what would move through next. Breeze, storm, something in between. I only knew the air was finally circulating, and I could breathe without borrowing someone else's lungs. The week after the cafe, the building felt a few degrees more breathable, as if the air system had finally figured out the difference between circulation and draft. We didn't avoid each other. We didn't seek each other out. We worked, competently, cleanly, like 2 people who had agreed to be precise with the sharp things. Then the calendar did what calendars do to nonprofits. It ambushed us with the gala. It lived in a spreadsheet called CONSTLATONS because someone in development believed themes keep rich people generous. I inherited logistics, floor plan, run of show, 37 vendors all convinced they were the main act. The museum we'd rented had ceilings that made even good decisions look ceremonial and acoustics that punished sloppy mic technique. Every email I sent felt like placing a stone on a path I hoped would hold when 100 donors in good shoes started walking across it. Jason stayed where heads of operations belong, slightly above the fray, unflustered, available when something truly structural needed moving. He asked good questions, not to catch me out, but to test load-bearing lines. What happens if the caterer's truck is late? Where does the keynote hide if she panics? Who owns the moment if the board chair exceeds his speech by 9 minutes? He would. It was not micromanagement. It was rehearsal. On the afternoon of the event, I stood under a scaffold of lights, headset crooked, notes clipped to a clipboard like a throwback, and watched the room inhale linen and become, for one night, a promise people could dress up for. Volunteers clipped name tags with missionary zeal. The florist, temples damp, genius evident, placed a final spray of feverfew and stepped back like a painter. The AV lead taught me the language of fail-safes and redundancy. I fell a little in love with the competence of strangers. At 6:15, before the doors opened, Jason found me by the loading dock. He held out a bottle of water like he was offering a small treaty. 2 notes. He said, gentle. Security wants the donor wall entrance kept clear. Press is hovering there. And the board chairs arriving late. Switch the order if you need to. Better to roll than stall. Copy, I said, the headset making my voice sound like someone who belongs behind a curtain. Anything else? He hesitated. The hum of the generator covered a long breath. You're doing this well, he said. Not performatively, actually well, was the kind of sentence that would have bent me years ago. Tonight it landed where it should, as fuel, not fire. Thank you, I said and meant it. Go be important somewhere visible. I'll keep the guts moving. Did. The doors opened. The room filled with the rustle of money pretending to be modest. Programs slid into palms. The quartet tuned itself into grace. And for 3 hours, the machine ran. Speeches shorter than feared, applause warmer than expected. A pledge drive that made the development director squeeze my forearm hard enough to bruise and whisper donor X, just texted an extra 50. Whatever you did with the lighting stays forever. It was the lighting and also the story we had chosen to tell about the work. Clean, specific, human. Jason had insisted on that edit. He was right. Near the end, after the silent auction had gracefully become noisy, and the string lights had tricked even skeptics into thinking they were part of something larger than themselves, a donor pulled me into a photo with her and the board chair. I smiled like a person who knows how to be useful on camera, and thought, absurdly, of being 22 and saying the sentence that moved a wedding. The distance between those 2 acts was a decade of learning what power is for. Later, when the last van beeped into the night and the florist reclaimed their vases and the museum sighed back into itself, I took off the headset and felt the groove it had left behind. The building crews stacked chairs with the choreography of people who might not love their jobs, but love doing them right. I thanked them the way I wished more people had thanked my father when he stayed after the party to wipe countertops. It costs nothing to see. Walk. Jason asked, appearing like a quiet period after a paragraph that had gone on too long. Outside, the city was relief. The air had cooled. The brick had released its stored heat. Trash bags did their weekly declaration that humans are complicated. We fell into step without deciding to. I meant what I said, he offered. You were steady, is my love language, I said, and made him laugh, a real sound that came from somewhere lower than a polite chuckle. We turned the corner toward a block of storefronts that were either closed or too loud, the way cities split themselves into sleep and performance at midnight. A neon sign flickered open in pink that had given up. We didn't go in. We stood under it like we were waiting for a bus that would take us back to simpler versions of ourselves. He put his hands in his pockets, that old gesture that used to mean he was choosing his words. I don't want to complicate your life, he said. It was such an impossible sentence, complication being the only consistent condition of our knowing each other, that I almost smiled. Then don't, I said. We can just work. He nodded, looked at the sky as if checking for forecast. Then without drama, I'm separated. The word landed like a misfired glass, no shatter, just a sound that told you something had cracked elsewhere. Long? I asked, voice level. Since late fall. Papers filed in January. It's quiet. We were careful with each other, and also careless for too long. He paused. It's not why I hired you. I didn't know. Your resume crossed my desk without a photo. But when you walked into that conference room, history stood up. I finished for him. He breathed a laugh. Yeah, kept standing. Someone somewhere dropped a bottle. The sound skittered down the block. I thought about policy hours, the organization, about power and the illusion that declaring something off limits removes its gravitational field, about the ethical math of being the boss and the woman who had once detonated a family dinner with a single true sentence. I can't do secrets, I said finally. Not like that, not again. Looked at me with relief, the kind that doesn't ask to be absolved of consequence. I wouldn't ask you to, he said. And I won't pretend the timing isn't terrible. If we were just two people at a museum after a long day, it would be simple. We're not. No, I agreed. We're people in a building with HR. That made him smile in a way that made the streetlight kinder. Policy says no reporting lines, no influence on compensation or advancement, disclosure if something changes. Policy is smarter than romance, I said. He shook his head. Policy is there because romance often isn't. We walked again. At the corner he stopped, and for a second I thought he'd reach for my hand. He didn't. He made a different choice. If you ever decided there's anything here worth risking for, he said, I'd move, out of your chain, out of any decision that touches you. I'd tell HR before I told you. He swallowed. I won't lose you to a mistake I can prevent. The sentence sat between us like a bench we could both see but didn't sit on yet. Hey, I said. It was not consent. It was acknowledgement of a path that might exist. We parted there because grown-ups sometimes do the boring right thing, even when the cinematic wrong thing sighs with better lighting. The next morning, I wrote the debrief doc the way debrief docs should be written. What worked? What almost didn't? What we will fix next time. I sent thank yous nobody will ever read twice, and a small, specific note to the AV lead about the way he had calmed the keynote without making it a story about himself. I stayed late to help the development director carry leftover centerpieces to her aging Prius, and listened to her say the theme had landed in donors' chests like a bird that remembered its way home. I went back upstairs and found a sticky note on my screen in a hand I knew. Board wants the run-of-show template. Can I brag about you without making you hate me? I wrote yes, brag responsibly, and stuck it to his doorframe like a person who owns her competence. 2 weeks later, we did the thing both of us had said we would do if ever. We booked a 15-minute slot with HR, separately, back-to-back, and disclosed not a relationship, but a potential. It felt strange and adult, and slightly absurd to tell a stranger with a soft sweater and a harder gaze that we were not dating and might never, but that the possibility existed and power needed to be considered in advance. She looked at us like we were either ideal employees or extremely well-coached criminals. She thanked us. She told him plainly that if anything changed, he would have to exit my reporting line immediately, recuse from my reviews, from any decision touching my salary, my title, my projects. He agreed without flinch. I watched the muscles in his jaw remember how to release. I expected to feel ashamed. I didn't. I felt like someone finally learning to steer a ship instead of blamming current. Summer dragged its feet onto the calendar. Projects multiplied the way they do when community partners are brave enough to ask for more. On a Thursday that smelled like asphalt, we drove out to a site visit 2 hours away in a car that did not care about our history. It was a long, quiet stretch of highway that used to be a river in some other geologic agreement. We talked about budgets and a warehouse we might lease, and whether it's possible to teach urgency without importing panic. We did not talk about us. The fields on either side of the road accepted our restraint with the patience of grass. At the sight, a woman with tired hands and unkillable eyes walked us through the center she ran. Kids in mismatched t-shirts moved through the space like they'd been granted a reprieve from a sentence we couldn't see. A teenager showed me the garden bed he'd built from pallets and faith. Jason asked questions that gave the woman back her expertise. I watched her stand taller in real time. It's a kind of magic when men make room without pretending it's charity. On the drive home, rain gathered itself into a decision and came down in a way that made the world simple. Wipers, white lines, the immediate problem of staying between them. We hit a stretch where traffic slowed to a crawl behind brake lights performing their tiny ballet. He leaned forward, squinting, the way people do when concentration asks the face to participate. Pull off, I said when I saw a diner's neon shouting at the rain. We'll wait it out. Inside, the coffee was the kind that punishes nostalgia. The waitress called us hun and didn't care if our answers were true. A family of 4 debated whether pie counts as dinner. It does, sometimes. The rain drummed on the roof with the insistence of a memory trying to be heard. Jason wrapped his hands around the mug again, like heat is a habit. I filed the last set of papers, he said, eyes on the window where a river of rain made the parking lot look like a cheap mirror. Mediation is next week. We're kind to each other. It's still sad, and sad can coexist, I said. He nodded. I stayed longer than I should have because I wanted to be the kind of person who stays. Turns out staying isn't always the kindest thing. Sat with that. A kid dropped a fork 2 booths over. His father said nothing sharp, just handed him a clean one as if grace were refillable. He looked at me then, not the window. The diner light did its unforgiving work. It showed the tired and the true. I like you, he said simply. No performance, no grand jury. Not because of the past, not because of the story we could tell about it. Because of who you are now, because of how you do things. Should have been a relief, and it was, and also it was frightening in the way cliffs are frightening even when you're strapped to the right gear. I like you too, I said, because lying had never saved either of us. But I will not be your secret, and I will not be your shortcut, and I will not be the reason anyone at work has to question my title. I know, he answered. We do this like people who plan, or we don't do it at all. Terms and conditions, I said, managing a smile. Terms and conditions, he repeated, letting the words be a scaffold instead of a cage. We waited out the rain. When the sky had wrung itself out enough to see the lines again, he paid in cash and left a tip that made the waitress raise her eyebrows. And we drove back to the city, hands behaved, language careful, the car full of a future that didn't demand we decide it that second. The next morning, he sent an email to HR with a subject line so dry it squeaked. Proposed change in reporting structure. By month's end, I reported to the deputy COO, a woman with a spine you could set clocks against and a laugh that made bad news survivable. My compensation migrated into a committee's hands. My performance would live under eyes that did not have his history in them. Policy had not killed momentum. It had given it a track. We took a walk on a Sunday. Neutral territory. A botanical garden where the paths are so well behaved you can think without tripping. We didn't hold hands. We looked at plants that have survived worse climates than ours. He told me about the first time he'd met Maya, how she had made him feel seen, and how, over time, he had turned that tenderness into an obligation neither of them could sustain. I told him about the kitchen and the cheap sangria and the sentence that had believed confession was a cure. We didn't flatter our younger selves. We didn't crucify them either. On a bridge over a pond being too earnest about its lilies, he asked if he could kiss me. The question felt old-fashioned in a way that honored the moment. I said yes. It was not cinematic, it was careful. The kind of kiss you survive with all your intelligence intact. We sat on a bench afterward like people who had just signed something with invisible ink. Now what? I asked, the oldest question, made suddenly reasonable by good governance. Now we go slow, he said. Tell the right people at the right time. We keep showing up at work like professionals. We don't ask HR to sponsor a fairy tale. We build something that wouldn't crumble if nobody knew, I said, feeling equal parts terror and surety. Okay, unspooled. We didn't become a spectacle. We became a schedule. Wednesday dinners cooked in my small kitchen like a truce, Saturday mornings that sometimes included a museum and sometimes included nothing more ambitious than clean sheets and silence. He moved out of the apartment he had kept out of habit and into a place with fewer expectations built into the walls. I refused to be the next plate in a pattern. He refused to let me. We told HR when there was something to tell. We told my new boss. She raised one eyebrow, said good boundaries, and when I said yes, asked about my pipeline like a general making sure the army keeps moving while civilians figure their hearts out. He told the board chair he was recused from anything touching me. The chair, a woman who had outlived several startups and a divorce, grunted her approval and told him that ethics looks better in practice than in decks. What we did not do was tell my family. Not yet. Not because we planned a secret. Because we owed the truth the dignity of being ready to absorb the blast. Maya lived in another city now. We weren't in the same orbit. There were no casual collisions to prepare us. When the telling came, it would be a door kicked in. We chose to build a room that could withstand it. In August, the divorce finalized. He forwarded me the final notice without commentary. I read it on my couch with the same reverence you give to paper that makes a life official. Dissolution is such an odd word. It makes an ending sound like sugar disappearing into tea. This had not dissolved. It had been dismantled kindly. We went out for pho and ate like people who know how to be grateful for broth. He didn't toast to freedom. He didn't pretend sadness didn't still live in the corners. He thanked me for patience, for structure, for not letting him make me a subplot. I thanked him back for slowness I had not thought him capable of when we were all so much younger and the kitchen was loud. On the walk home, we stopped under a streetlight that made us look like better versions of ourselves. He took my hand, finally, in public, where the city could witness without caring. A couple walked past us arguing about paint colors. A bus exhaled. Somewhere a dog declared himself heroic. The world welcomed and ignored us at once. It felt exactly right. Back at my door, he didn't ask to come up. He kissed my forehead like a promise he wasn't in a hurry to cash, and said goodnight in that low voice that had ruined me 10 years and a lifetime ago. Inside, I leaned against the door and listened to my own pulse answer back. The room felt aired out and furnished, ready for the next thing that would ask to live there. We had crossed the line with all the paperwork filed. We had terms and conditions that felt like care, not constriction. There would be consequences still, the human kind, the family kind. But we had built the scaffolding strong. I blew out the candle I'd forgotten to extinguish before dinner. Smoke curled in the shape of maybe. I opened a window and let it out. We spent the fall building something that didn't need an audience to be true. Wednesdays became hours. Groceries carried up 2 flights. A knife that finally held an edge. A ritual of making dinner that felt like writing our names on a small, private page. Weekends were cautious. A museum an hour before opening because quiet is the cleanest kind of permission. A hike on a trail that asked more of ankles than of nerves. The kind of nap you can only take when no one will accuse you of laziness. We told the right people at work at the right times. HR had our disclosures in a tidy folder. My reporting line lived elsewhere. His recusal was a verb, not a claim. It was almost boring in its correctness, which is to say it was what neither of us had known how to do 10 years ago. Winter made the city honest. On a night that squeaked underfoot, he handed me an envelope that was not a surprise and still made my hands go still. The final court stamp, the last punctuation of a marriage that had ended before either of us learned to pronounce its grief. We stood in my kitchen and looked at the paper the way people look at a map that shows they've already crossed the state line. He didn't toast. I didn't say finally. We put the page in a drawer with the other documents that make a life legible. Lease, passport, voter registration. Then we made soup and ate it, as if hunger were the only simple thing in the world. We kept not telling my family because telling them would not be news. It would be a siren. But spring makes even cowards restive. The nonprofit was blooming. New contracts. A pilot that wasn't just a pitch deck. And I had moved from program manager to the person you sent when something was both fragile and important. The deputy COO, a woman built of quartz and mercy, took me to coffee and said the board wanted me to stand up a new unit. Implementation and learning. You aren't loud, she said. You're clear. You make rooms smarter by 5% just by staying calm. I went home and told the basil on my windowsill because it had listened to me longer than anyone else in this city. Then I called Jason. He said that's exactly right, like he'd been waiting for the world to catch up. Success has a way of making the omissions around it look bigger. We could not keep living like everything important about my life fit inside a folder at HR. So I called my mother and asked if we could come to dinner. She said yes with a tone that suggested she didn't believe in yes as a concept, but enjoyed its hospitality. The table was the same table where I'd confessed the sentence that rerouted us all. The chairs knew what had happened. So did the oven. My father orchestrated a parade of plates, as if food could outrun consequence. Maya wasn't there. She lived 2 states away now and refused to be in the same air as my name. My mother had set an extra place anyway, out of habit or hope or cruelty. It's hard to tell with her. Jason arrived carrying flowers that were tasteful, not romantic. He kissed my father's cheek and handed him a bottle of something that didn't taste like apology. We sat. People say there's no right way to do a wrong thing. I disagree. There are sentences that hurt less because they are precise. Between the salad and the roast, I said mine. I said that we were together, that the timing had been careful, that his divorce was final, that we had told our employer before we told anyone else because work had taught us discipline in ways the heart had not. I did not justify the old kitchen. I did not rehearse our decade of penance. I described the present and offered no bargains. My mother cried. She cries like it's a sport, full body, strategic, aware of the optics, and still, tears carry their own sincerity. My father cleared his throat and looked at his hands, which have always been more articulate than his mouth. He asked Jason if he would be good to me. Jason said yes in a tone that understood good as a verb, not a virtue. My mother said she didn't know how to tell the ants. My father said the ants already knew everything before we do, and that they would go on living regardless. And then, this is the part that still surprises me when I hold it up to the light. My mother reached across the table and took my face in her hands the way mothers do on television and said, "You have always made the kind of trouble you could live with. If this is your trouble, then we will set a plate for it." We ate dessert unsteadily. My father told a story about a neighbor who had planted tomatoes too early and saved them with blankets during a frost. My mother asked Jason if he still read the boring books he used to choose for beach vacations. He said yes, more boring now. We spoke around the absence like you speak around a missing tooth. There was relief in the room that felt indecent to name. After all these years, the ghost had a seat and a napkin and a fork. The haunting was out loud. I called Maya the next morning because not calling her would have been the cruelest kind of courtliness. She didn't pick up. I left a message that was not an argument. I wrote that I loved her, that I understood her anger has a right to the whole room, that I would carry her silence if that's what she needed to live well. The message didn't return as anything. No text, no voicemail, no mailed back card. Her refusal was clean. I honored the cleanliness. At work, good things kept happening in the least cinematic ways. The board approved the new unit. I hired a small team of people who were allergic to nonsense and gifted at turning big feelings into checklists that didn't insult reality. We ran a pilot in 3 neighborhoods and took notes like archaeologists. We made the spreadsheet beautiful, and in doing so, made it honest. On the day the board chair announced the unit publicly, she looked at me over her glasses and said, "Don't get shiny. Get deep." I said yes, and meant I don't know how to be shiny anyway. Jason stayed out of my orbit like we'd agreed, which turned out to be easier than I'd feared and harder than I'd hoped. We were lovers in the grammar of evenings and weekends and strangers who nodded in the hall with the deliberate blankness 2 professionals can wear when the stakes demand it. Sometimes I wanted to knock on his office door at noon just to borrow the sight of his face, and I didn't. Sometimes he sent me an article about data ethics that made me swear out loud, and I waited until after 5 to send him the sentence it had made me write. Summer tilted toward the anniversary of the night under the streetlight when we decided to be careful on purpose. He asked if I'd take a day off. I picked a Friday because Fridays are the most generous. We drove to the coast before dawn like teenagers with contraband. At a cove where the light arrives later than the rest of the world, he took my hands and said a sentence I'd thought my chest had retired, that he wanted to marry me. He had no ring. He had God help me sense. He had already emailed HR a month ago with the contingency plan. The board chair had endorsed it with a thumbs-up emoji that looked ridiculous and appropriate. My boss had shrugged and asked for my Q3 milestones. He held out instead of a diamond, a folded paper, a rough draft of what our life would promise, financial transparency, Wednesdays remain ours, 1 weekend a month for something bigger than ourselves, no phones at dinner, a standing appointment with couples therapy whether we felt like it or not. Terms and conditions, he said, almost shy. I don't want romance to be our only governance. I said yes because I've never believed yes belongs to jewelry. I said yes because the draft was already a kind of vow. We married a year to the week after the streetlight, in a courthouse with linoleum that had seen better fashions. My father wore his good suit and held my mother's purse while she cried less dramatically than usual. The board chair sent flowers with a card that read "Be boring in all the right ways." 2 coworkers who had converted skepticism into affection stood in the back and clapped like humans, not colleagues. Jason's brother, the one family member of his I'd never managed to dislike, took photos on a phone and managed to make them look like film. We went to lunch at a place that called itself a tavern, but served food that respected vegetables. We did not post. We did not perform. We went home and took a nap that felt like arriving at a quiet border where the guards don't care who you used to be. The fallout with Maya wasn't cinematic either. There were no scenes. There was only the long ache of a sister-shaped silence that turned holidays into maps you navigate with detours. My parents split their time like diplomats. My mother declared that no one was required to be happy, only decent. My father kept setting a 4th plate on certain nights as an act of stubborn love. The plate stayed empty. I stopped measuring my life by whether it might one day be full. Work tested us the way work tests love, not with crises, but with the slow drag of success. My unit grew. We picked up 2 cities, I learned to write budgets that function like poems, compressed, precise, containing more than their line length suggested. Jason's role expanded in that inevitable way competence attracts responsibility. He declined panels that wanted him to opine about leadership and sent them 3 women from our org who actually did the work. He came home tired and sane. We lit a candle at dinner not to be romantic, but to mark the difference between ours, where the world owned us, and ours, that belonged to our small republic. In the fall, the landlord raised the rent in a way that felt less like capitalism and more like a dare. We took it. We also started looking. House hunting in our city is an exercise in humility. Every door believes it is a metaphor. We found a narrow place on a tree-lined street that flooded twice a decade and forgave itself immediately. The stairs creaked in sentences. The kitchen window knew how to frame mourning. We bought it because neither of us had ever wanted a house that impressed other people. We wanted a house that made us patient. On the day we signed, we stood in the empty living room and listened to the silence consider us. It let us in. We kept Wednesdays. We set up the spare room not as an office, but as a room with a couch for reading and a rug that insisted on bare feet. We hung nothing on the walls for months because blankness felt like an honest luxury. I planted basil outside because I wanted the new windowsill to start without obligations. We learned which neighbor's dog considered himself mayor and which teenagers cut through the yard with a courtesy wave. On Saturdays, we walked to a bakery that didn't do anything fancy to bread and put butter on slices with the attention of priests. Somewhere in there, the conversation about children moved from hypothetical to logistics. We weren't in a hurry. We also weren't performing our reluctance. We made the doctor appointments. We learned the acronyms and did not let them become our liturgy. We practiced sleeping without our phones in the bedroom. We practiced asking for help from people who would not treat our vulnerability like a coupon. We watched our friends, kids in parks, and learned which playgrounds keep the sun too long and which let shade win graciously. When I look back at that year now, I don't see fireworks. I see a string of decent choices made with the humility that comes from having once burned down a village and then spent a decade carting water. I see my mother learning to say our names together without sighing, and if sometimes the sigh sneaks in, it belongs to her body, not her judgment. I see my father putting up a shelf in our new kitchen and refusing to get paid with anything but a sandwich and the satisfaction of a level bubble centered. I see Jason reading next to me on the couch, his ankle touching mine in that unconscious way long-married people do, and I am startled every time by the fact that we earned the right to that accident. Maya stayed gone. Her choice had a dignity I could not borrow. On the anniversary of the canceled wedding, I lit a candle not for us, but for the version of her I could no longer reach. Grief is not a debt. It is a companion you learn to give a chair. At work, my unit shipped something I'm still quietly proud of. A guidance we wrote with community partners that saved a smaller nonprofit 6 months of mistakes without making them feel rescued. The board clapped, then moved on to line items because that's what boards do. The deputy COO sent me a 3-sentence email that said more than most speeches. You made the thing. It works. Do it again. I closed my laptop and walked home through a neighborhood that had learned my face. On a soft night in late October, we sat on the back steps with mugs that steamed and said nothing. The basil was dead and dignified. The air held the right amount of wood smoke. Somewhere, a radio played a song that had tried to be an anthem and settled for being a memory. Jason's hand found mine. Not the way you seize something, the way you check that it's still there. We did it, he said, and I knew he meant not the house, not the jobs, not the respectable marriage license, but the discipline. The refusal to turn our story into a spectacle or a secret. The years between the kitchen and the courthouse where we learned to be exact with our vows. Yes, I said. The door we knew we'd kick was behind us now, off its hinges, repaired into an arch that let light move through. Ahead, an ordinary life was waiting, which is to say the best kind. One that asks for attention, not performance. One that can hold children if they come, grief when it arrives, parents as they soften, work that matters, Wednesdays that are sacred in the way routine is the holiest thing I know. We finished our tea. We went inside. The house did what good houses do. It kept. The winter after the house found our shape, the city decided to test our scaffolding. It didn't come as a lightning strike. It arrived like all institutional weather does, emails with subject lines that start friendly and end in policy. A local magazine, hungry for a feel-good profile, pitched a piece on quiet operators in the nonprofit sector. They wanted to talk to our board chair, our deputy COO, and Jason, whose name had become shorthand for the person who can find the emergency exit in any building. I wasn't on the list, which I found both correct and mildly insulting in the way competence often is. I sent talking points anyway, the way you put out placemats before anyone decides to eat. The reporter came with hair that knew how to perform sincerity and a notepad that lived for quotes. The interview took place in a conference room that had seen more budget variances than human drama. The chair did the high-level language. Jason did the humane logistics. The deputy COO did the spine work that keeps the organism upright. Near the end, the reporter gestured through the glass at my team, all hunched at their screens like air traffic controllers, and asked a question that could have been casual if she weren't so good at her job. And how do you keep your operations chief from crossing streams with implementation? Any conflicts of interest? We had prepared for this. We always had. Jason smiled the way you smile at a question that respects the shape of your integrity. He explained the reporting lines, his recusals, the committee structure that handled my compensation and progression. He referenced the original disclosures to HR and the annual attestations we filed like clockwork. He did not say my name. He did not need to. The process did the talking, as it should. The piece ran online 2 weeks later with a headline that managed to be both flattering and edible. The paragraph about conflict of interest was clean, boring, correct, a sentence about governance, and a quote from our chair that sounded less like spin and more like adulthood. I allowed myself 12 minutes of smugness before the universe reminded me that good processes do not vaccinate you against people. An email arrived at HR from an anonymous account with the kind of subject line you cannot unread. Favoritism complaint. The body of the note was a collage of old facts and new malice, that I'd been promoted too fast, that Jason had hired me because we had history, that I ran my unit like a court. I didn't. If anything, we were a union of nerds with checklists that everyone knew. The IP address was a coffee shop. The style felt like someone who'd watched too many prestige dramas about corruption in City Hall and decided prose could be a knife. HR did what HR has to do when the word favoritism enters the chat. They opened a review. Not a full investigation. Not yet. But a process check, the audit equivalent of sticking a dipstick into an engine to see whether the smoke is fatal or just theatrical. The deputy COO pinged me with a you-know-the-drill, and I did. The board chair scheduled a call that began with, "I'm annoyed we have to do this," and continued with, "We're going to do it thoroughly, because that is how you shut the door gently and firmly." For 2 weeks, my work became evidence of itself. I pulled emails that documented the reporting line change a year earlier, the recusal memos, the compensation committee minutes that had the bureaucratic poetry only numbers can write. The deputy COO sent HR my performance reviews with the same satisfaction a math teacher gets from a well-shown proof. My team sent anonymous feedback forms that said things like she asks better questions than she answers, and I never wonder if she's keeping a secret promotion in her drawer for herself. Jason sat for an interview and answered every question like a person who understood that character is tested most on Thursdays at 4 p.m. by people in cardigans. The review landed where we knew it would, boringly, cleanly. HR sent a memo that might as well have been a piece of white toast. Policies were followed, structures were sound, no evidence suggested preferential treatment. The organization remained a place where grown-ups could work without carrying a recorder in their pockets. Still, the anonymous complaint had done what it always does in ecosystems like ours. It had bled small rumors into corners. In the kitchen, laughter tightened a little when I walked in. In a meeting, someone's face held an expression that looked like the other side of a tabloid headline. I didn't chase it. I fed the organism. I kept my team's calendar full of useful work. I defended their time from meetings that eat meaning. I walked down the hall the way you walk down a hall when your spine belongs to you. I went home at a decent hour and stirred risotto as if patience were a muscle you could cook into yourself. But the world has a sense of humor I do not always appreciate. A week after HR closed the loop, I rounded the corner of the produce aisle and nearly ran into Maya. It was one of those grocery store collisions life writes so cheaply. Wednesday at 7, winter citrus stacked like ambitions, a song from our childhood misbehaving softly over the speakers. She was older in the way good faces age, sharper at the edges, more decisive. She wore a coat that announced she'd learned to buy things that last. She looked at me like you look at a painting you had hung in your own house for years and then taken down because it made the wall a liar. "Hi," I said, because Midwestern etiquette survives family wars. She nodded, emotion so spare it might have been wind. Her eyes did a quick inventory that did not include admiration. "How, Mom?" she asked. And the fact that she said mom instead of your mother was a generosity I refused to take for granted. "Trying to unionize the bridge club," I said. "Dad's the shop steward. They're fine." Silence arranged itself between the kumquats and the arugula. We were two women who had once borrowed each other's sweaters and now borrowed nothing. I could feel a speech pressing against my teeth, the kind that tries to do 10 years' work in 30 seconds. I didn't give it. Instead, I gave her a sentence I had saved for exactly this aisle, exactly this light, exactly this moment. I'm happy. I hope you are. It was not a bid. It was a bow of the head of the life. She studied me the way you study a cliff you've chosen not to climb. Then she gave me something that was either mercy or a mercy's cousin. Good, she said. Me too. We stood there, adjacent. My cart carried lemons and bulk almonds, and the basil I would try to keep alive again. Hers held broccoli, rabe, and oat milk, and a bouquet of flowers she wasn't carrying like a message for anyone but herself. I'm not going to come back, she said softly, and I understood this was not about cities. I know, I answered. You were always better at starting fires, she said, and the sentence did not carry an accusation. It carried an obituary for something we'd both loved when we were young enough to be careless with love. We moved then, in the choreography of polite strangers. I took my basil, she took her flowers. We both pretended not to see the child in the next aisle trying to smuggle a candy bar into the cart. Outside, the air was knife-bright. I stood for a second and let my breath condense into visible proof I was still here. At home, I put the basil into water like a relic. I told Jason about the produce aisle in 2 paragraphs. The facts, not the ache's poetry. He listened the way good men listen, with his eyes, not his counter-arguments. He didn't say he was sorry because he knows grief is not a problem. He put his hand on my back, warm and ordinary, and left it there while I cut lemons into dignified quarters. Work kept moving. My unit shipped a thing I loved, an internal field guide for new staff that read like it wanted them to be smarter, not obedient. The board chair sent a 3-word email, good, fold in, and I grinned at my screen like a child at a spelling bee. Jason spent a week untangling a facilities nightmare at one of our sites and came home with dust in his hair and the kind of relief you can only earn by finding the leak before it ruins the drywall. He decided to try for a baby in the least cinematic way possible, by not trying. We told no one. We bought nothing. We made space on a shelf as if generosity to the future could be rehearsed. On a Sunday in late March, I peed on a strip of paper in a bathroom that needed new grout and watched 2 pink lines translate themselves into a sentence my body had been waiting to read aloud. I sat on the edge of the tub and cried the kind of tears that don't require tissue. They're too clean for that. Jason knelt on the tile and put his forehead to my knee and laughed like a man who had just been handed a season. I wish the next paragraphs were simple. They aren't. At 8 weeks, during a meeting about a pilot in a neighborhood that distrusts pilots, I felt a cramp that didn't know how to pretend it was nothing. I excused myself, walked calmly to the restroom, and learned the alphabet of blood all over again. The ER doctor was kind in that Burnt Hedges way emergency rooms teach. An ultrasound drew a black and white map nobody wants to hang on a fridge. Words like spontaneous abortion tried to be clinical and failed. We went home through a city that had no idea what had been taken. I stayed in bed for 3 days, not because someone told me to, but because my body needed to relearn the math of enough. Jason made broth with hands that understand heat. He canceled meetings without explaining why to people who were not owed our story. My deputy came by with a bag of clementines and sat on the floor and told me about a coworker's ill-advised tattoo until I laughed. A brittle, grateful sound. My mother left soup at the door at an hour I would not open it. My father texted a photo of the sky from their porch with no caption. Maya did not call. She was not wrong. It was not her job. I went back to work the next Monday because grief had never taught me courage by letting me hide. I did not baptize my calendar in productivity. I let it carry me. I rescheduled site visits that required bad lighting. I kept the ones that required listening. I walked through the building with my hands open. People who knew said nothing, blessedly, and brought me small things that did not require thank you notes. A cappuccino, a link to an essay about benched athletes, a post-it with a joke about our printer that made me laugh hard enough to frighten the grant writer. At night, Jason and I lay on our backs and looked at the ceiling like it contained constellations that might answer to our need. We didn't promise each other anything except this, that we would not let hope turn into the kind of religion that makes martyrs of women. We would try again if my body said yes. We would not measure our marriage in outcomes. We would fall asleep with our feet touching, like people who had survived worse. Spring did what it always does to cities that believe in their own stamina. It greened the edges, forgave the potholes, made alleys smell like something other than a decision. My team landed a grant that funded precisely the thing we had refused to oversell. Jason convinced a vendor to do a job at cost by reminding them that reputation is a currency you can spend only once. On a Saturday morning, when the light was the color of forgiveness, we painted the smallest room in the house a white so warm it almost told the truth. The magazine that had profiled us did a follow-up, this time on ethical leadership. They wanted to talk about anonymous complaints and process and how you build trust that survives gossip. The board chair answered on the record with grace. I declined to be quoted. I wrote the line she used instead. We don't manage perception, we manage practice. Perception catches up. It ran under her name. Exactly right. In June, I stood in front of the staff at our quarterly all-hands and presented the early outcomes from a year of the new unit. I did not sell triumph. I sold iteration. I showed where we'd been wrong and how we turned wrong into right without humiliating the people who had done the trying. When I finished, the room didn't cheer. It exhaled. The deputy COO mouthed good from the back. Jason sat 3 rows in and didn't clap any louder than anyone else. We walked back to our offices without touching because that, too, is a vow. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that wasn't unknown at all. A photo of a toddler in a striped shirt at a splash pad, cheeks so alive you wanted to send the son a thank you note. The message read, "Thought you should see what joy can do when it learns to walk. Maya." No punctuation, no return address beyond the shared blood that had outlived our choosing. I sat at my desk and let my chest do the thing it does when the past sends a peace offering that is not an invitation back, only a proof of life. I wrote back one sentence. "Thank you for sending me light." The dots didn't appear. They didn't need to. The photo stayed in my phone like a mercy with a timestamp. On a Sunday evening in late July, we took our plates to the back steps and ate watermelon with our hands like children who had been granted a late bedtime. The air kept its promise. The street lights did their gentle surveillance. Somewhere, a neighbor was learning the same 3 chords on a guitar and not improving. Jason leaned into my shoulder like a habit your body acquires without permission. "We made it through an audit," he said, and we both knew he didn't mean HR. "Yes," I said, "we did." He turned his head and kissed the place below my ear where skin remembers every good thing faster than the mind does. "Ready for another year?" he asked, the way marathoners grin at the foolishness of their endurance. "Always," I said, and it felt less like a boast than a prayer. Inside, on the kitchen table, the house keys lay in their bowl, heavy with their quiet work. We carried our plates in, set them in the sink, and stood for a breath looking at the room we'd built. The scarred table, the basil in its stubborn second life, the schedule on the fridge written in ink we weren't afraid of anymore. The world would keep asking us to prove ourselves. We would keep choosing the boring, steady answers that save lives without headlines. I turned off the light. The dark held us like a witness. August asked for stamina, not spectacle. The new unit stopped feeling like a launch and started feeling like plumbing. Reliable when nobody notices, catastrophic only if it fails. I learned the rhythm of my team's strengths the way a bandleader learns who needs the downbeat a millisecond early. We built checklists that didn't condescend, retros that didn't humiliate, a culture of saying what did we learn instead of who is to blame. It was not glamorous. It was the work. At home, the house settled into its own intelligence. The old floorboards memorized our feet. The neighbor's morning radio became an unofficial alarm. We became the people who returned tools on time and overwatered basil only once. On Friday nights, we fed each other end-of-week sentences that opened with the small heroics. The maintenance lead who kept a site open during a storm. The program associate who quietly drove a client to court. The grant writer who refused to gild a failure and found the funder respected honesty more than polish. Eventually, we decided to try again. No talismans, no secret bargains with the ceiling, just care. Vitamins remembered, calendars gently cleared around the day's biology marked in pencil, appointments scheduled without turning hope into homework. When the stick blushed positive, we let joy in like a cautious houseguest. Welcome, but not yet given a drawer. The midwife's office had lamps that refused to be fluorescent, a trick so kind it seemed like cheating. Early scans showed a flicker that translated itself into a drumbeat. The midwife, a woman who treated optimism like a muscle you keep limber, told us what to expect and what to ignore. We chose who to tell. Not many. My deputy because logistics is a love language and my calendar would need a translator. HR because paperwork is a spell that protects what joy cannot. My parents because even flawed love can be a windbreak. I didn't call Maya. I sent a postcard of a lighthouse with no words and trusted her to read the intention without obligation. The card went out. Nothing came back. That, too, was an answer. Work did not pause for our private weather. A city partner pulled out of a pilot with the kind of timing that makes conspiracy theorists feel useful. We regrouped in a conference room that smelled like whiteboard markers and determination. The deputy gave me the floor. I resisted the urge to solve alone. The team mapped what could be salvaged, what needed to be grieved, what might be reborn with different letters after its name. Jason sat against the wall, recused from the decision and still the calm in the room's barometer. The plan we left with wasn't beautiful. It was honest. It held. In month 9 at the organization and month 4 of the new Heartbeat, the magazine that had sniffed around earlier published a second piece on our sector. Less flattering, more hungry for edges. They'd found a nonprofit across town with leadership whose ethics were PowerPoint deep. The piece named names. It did not name ours. Still, the calls started. Funders gently checking fences, partners asking how we quarantined conflict. The board chair pushed me to the front and let me answer as the person who built the gates. I wrote a short public note, no defensiveness, no brand varnish, explaining our structure, our disclosures, our commitment to being boring about integrity. It read like a manual. It landed like relief. Sometimes the most radical sentence in a city addicted to spectacle is, "Here is the policy. Here is how we follow it." At home, the first trimester ended with the cautious fanfare of a scan that showed limbs declaring themselves. We let ourselves buy one small thing, a board book about a bear who goes to the library. I put it on the shelf in the spare room among the novels that had been our only children so far, and the sight of its squat spine settled something in me I hadn't noticed was restless. On Wednesdays, we cooked simple things that didn't offend my new, strange senses. He learned which smells made me walk out of rooms. I learned which foods steadied me when my body decided to roll its own credits mid-morning. We practiced sleeping early like it was a discipline. He read to my belly when the house was quiet, not for the science, though there is some, but for the ritual of building a third chair into our conversation. In late fall, a budget fight threatened the part of our city that takes public money and turns it into outcomes. The council wanted headlines. Our sector wanted reservoirs. I prepped Jason for testimony, then stayed home that night because the baby wanted soup and the couch wanted my spine horizontal. He texted me after midnight with the exact vote count and the line we'd preserved. I sent back a photo of my belly under the blanket and the caption, "Your lobbyist is asleep." He came home and stood in the doorway, taking it in as if the room had been staged just to test his gratitude. My parents drifted closer in the months that followed, not like a weather front that wants to dominate, more like scaffolding you didn't ask for but are glad to see. My mother's critiques rerouted into recipes and unsolicited advice about sleep that I set aside without blowing up the bridge. My father wandered over on Sundays with tools he insisted needed to meet our baseboards. He installed a shelf in the future room with the kind of ceremony men like him allow themselves when language is too expensive. He asked nothing about names. He hammered like a benediction. Work gave me a promotion I'd been doing underneath my job title, Director of Implementation and Learning, which is a mouthful and also exactly the work. The deputy COO wrote the recommendation. The compensation committee handled the numbers. Jason's name appeared nowhere except on the calendar. He blocked every Wednesday from 5 to 9 without apology. The board chair pulled me aside after the vote and said, "We're the authority you already carry. Stop asking permission to be the adult in the room." I went back to my desk and rearranged nothing. Sometimes power is just a posture. The pregnancy eased into the second trimester's relative mercy. There were appointments with gel and measurements with names that sound like good horses. We told a few more people. I watched colleagues do the math and then relax at the sight of our structure doing its job in public. Workload redistributed without resentment. Timelines reset without drama. A plan for leave that didn't ask anyone to be a hero. One Saturday, the doorbell delivered a package with Maya's handwriting. Inside was a small knitted hat the color of undramatic sky. No note. Just the thing itself, proof that love can practice from far away. I cried into it the way you cry when your body recognizes mercy and falls to its knees. Jason held me and didn't try to name the moment in a way that would make it heavier or lighter. We put the hat on the shelf, next to the bear and beneath my father's level shelf, and the room felt more habitable than it had the day before. In month 6, the anonymous emailer tried again, this time with a new address and fewer adjectives. HR did not open a formal review. They sent a form response, archived it, and then took us to coffee, not because policy demanded it, but because kindness does. They asked if we were still okay with the structure. We were. They asked if we wanted any adjustments as the due date approached. We made 2 small ones. A deputy to my deputy for the months I'd be out, and a standing decision from Jason to skip all hands where I presented, even though the policy didn't require it. Clean lines travel farther than pride. Winter moved in. We bought a space heater older than our marriage from a neighbor who swore it had personality. The future room got curtains that did not ask to be remarked upon. I found myself waking at 3 to the strange, profound stillness of a house holding 3 sleepers. Sometimes I padded to the kitchen and ate half a banana like a raccoon. Sometimes I stood in the doorway of the small room and let the dark rearrange the furniture into a promise. On the last day of the year, we did not go to a party. We made stew and listened to the city perform enthusiasm. At midnight, we kissed like people who had learned not to negotiate with time. When the fireworks punched the air, the baby kicked like a person with opinions. We laughed, unbelieving and completely certain. In the morning, we wrote down the only resolution we meant to keep: stay boring about the important things. Work would call with its big asks. Family would show up with its little emergencies. The baby would arrive on its schedule, not ours. We would leave our phones in the kitchen at night. We would go to therapy on Thursdays even when we thought we were fine. We would keep Wednesdays sacred. We would not try to solve loneliness with new projects. We would let the house teach us the sound of a life that can hold 3 breaths at once. Season 2 had tests left to administer, but the audit had taught us what to look for. Our scaffolding held. The basil died and came back again. The neighbor's dog campaigned for re-election and won. And in the spare room, under a knitted sky, the future kept gathering itself, patient as a tide. Labor began the way emails do, quietly, then all at once. A Thursday in late March, a meeting that wanted to be longer than my spine, a cramp I learned not to negotiate with. I texted my deputy 3 words, handing off now, closed my laptop like a benediction, and walked home under a sky that had chosen mercy. We'd practiced 1,000 contingencies. The bag was by the door, fat with pragmatism. The list of who to tell was a note on the fridge, trimmed to the bone. Jason met me on the porch with a face that knew joy and logistics could hold hands. He called the midwife. I changed into a t-shirt with a history I trusted. The house tilted into its role, soft and ready. It was not cinematic. It was work. It was breath counted like votes. It was my body remembering a script it had been studying for months in a language older than guilt. Jason's voice stayed low and present, counting with me, not for me. The midwife arrived with calm and towels in that order. The hours stacked themselves like sandbags against a flood I wanted to invite and survive. Once, when a contraction tried to turn me into a cathedral, I laughed, an exhausted, unbelieving sound, at the memory of the 2 pink lines on a stick in a bathroom that needed grout. Just before dawn, the room gathered. The house held its breath. I pushed like a woman who knew endings and beginnings are the same verb. And then there was a thin cry that cut the air into something new. A small, angry person arrived, purple with effort and indignant about cold. The midwife placed him on my chest, where his fury converted to concentration. Rooting, finding, becoming. Jason cried the way good men do when language retires. Shoulders, hands, the whole project humbled and grateful. We named him after no one, a name that would not borrow a history it hadn't earned. My father came by that evening with a casserole he refused to let us compliment. My mother stood at the foot of the bed and adjusted the blanket with such ferocious tenderness I forgave her every bridge she'd burned for sport. On the second day, a box arrived without a return address. Inside, another small hat, the same wool as the first, larger by an inch, the color of early morning. No note. The knitted mercy of a sister who would not come back and would not abandon us entirely. I put it on our son's head and whispered thank you to a room we both once owned. Leave is supposed to be a pause. It is not. It is a different curriculum. Days became concentric circles. Feed, change, stare in disbelief. Repeat. Nights were negotiations with a tiny union boss whose demands were reasonable and relentless. Friends from work dropped food on the porch and fled, the new etiquette of love. My deputy texted only when something truly required my signature, which was almost never. The unit kept shipping. Jason learned to swaddle like a contractor wraps ductwork. We made rules we could keep. No martyrdom, no competing, no weaponizing exhaustion. On Wednesdays, we still cooked. Simpler, quieter, with one of us bouncing near the stove while the other salted water like an incantation. In month 2, we took the baby to the office on a day the building felt like a library. HR asked nothing of us but names and admired the hat. The board chair peered into the carrier and said, "Another stakeholder," then ruined it by smiling. My team did that collective inhale groups do when a new human makes time smaller. We stayed 20 minutes. It was enough. Work did not punish me for disappearing. It had prepared. The deputy ran meetings like a person born for midlines, not spotlights. The unit met targets without pretending that targets are the point. When I returned, it was on a schedule we wrote in pencil and then traced in ink. I took the mornings. I kept Wednesdays. I refused the panels. I accepted the messy, proud work that existed before anyone thought to capitalize it. The first time I stood at the whiteboard again, my handwriting surprised me. Steadier, less apologetic. I drew an arrow and made a joke about my new project manager at home. People laughed in the gentle, grateful way relief laughs. Jason moved around the building like a man who understood his family was not a distraction from his job, but its covenant. He left early when leaving early was the right answer. He declined after-hours calls that could be emails. He opened rooms and then got out of them. At home, he sang badly on purpose to make the baby furious, and then soothed him like a magician who doesn't break character. Summer eased us into a shape we could keep. My mother learned to ring the bell once and then go away if we didn't answer. My father took the stroller for errands that were just slow loops around the block while we showered without an audience. On a bright Saturday, a small envelope arrived addressed in Maya's tidy hand. Inside, a photo of her boy, older now, holding a cardboard sign that read "Welcome, cousin," in marker the color of forgiveness. No signature. I cried into the sink and let the hot water run because sometimes plumbing is the only witness you can trust. I propped the photo on the shelf under the bears and the hats. We did not call. We did not post. We let the gesture be the room it wanted to be. In September, the city remembered it could be unkind. A funder changed priorities with the Caprice success cells as strategy. We stood up a plan B without setting anything on fire. I flew once to a partner site 2 states away and discovered airports still smelled like stress and pretzels. On the plane home, I watched a video of our son discovering his hands and understood, viscerally, the phrase "grip strength." I landed, turned my phone off on purpose, and took a cab to the house that knew to leave the porch light on for the version of me that travels. The magazine, the first one, the one that loves a tidy arc, emailed again, sniffing for a work-life balance profile. I deleted it. We were not an arc. We were a kitchen calendar, a budget, a baby with opinions, a unit that refused to confuse excellence with theater. "We don't give them our story," Jason said into my hair that night, and I said, "We keep it." On our courthouse anniversary, we ate pie in bed during nap time and read a page of a book out loud before the baby decided literature was for suckers. We toasted with seltzer and orange slices because adulthood, at its best, is creative with limits. I looked at Jason's face, older and better, and thought of the kitchen 10 years back, the sentence I could never take back, and the season we built so we wouldn't have to. In the fall, my unit shipped a revision of the field guide that included a chapter called "Boring Miracles." How to set up a site in 48 hours without anyone crying. How to write a grant report that tells the truth and still gets renewed. How to run a retrospective that sends people back to their desks sharper, not smaller. We printed it on cheap paper on purpose so people would mark it up without reverence. The board chair sent a one-line email, "Frame it and throw it away." And I laughed out loud in the conference room until the grant writer threatened to file a noise complaint. We threw our son a first birthday party that lasted 45 minutes and ended with an acceptable level of frosting on the floor. My parents argued about nothing in the living room and then fell asleep on the couch, heads tilted in mirror image. A small package arrived midway through the chaos. A wooden truck, handmade, sanded smooth. No card. Maya's work, unmistakable. I watched our boy gnaw the bumper like it owed him money, and felt a quiet thread run from one house to another, strong enough to hang a piece on. That night, after the dishwasher lied about being quiet, we sat on the back steps with a baby monitor that crackled like old radio. The air was honest again. The street's guitar student had learned a 4th chord. We passed a mug of tea back and forth and said nothing worth quoting. "We did it," Jason said finally, soft in the way pride gets when it knows better than to shout. "We're doing it," I corrected, "because tenses matter when you're talking about a life." He nodded, forehead against my temple, as if to promise he understood the grammar. The monitor sighed and then held its peace. Inside, the house went on keeping. In the spare room, under 2 hats and a bear, a boy slept like a promise we'd decided to keep without making it a performance. The thing about ordinary glory is that you don't notice it while it's happening. It's a clean sink at 9 p.m., a whiteboard half erased, a team that writes each other into being, a sister's silence padded with gifts, a mother's critique rerouted into soup, a father's shelf level for the first time on the first try. It's 2 people who once set their village on fire and then spent a decade learning the chemistry of water. It's knowing how to say no to a magazine and yes to a nap. It's a Wednesday that stays sacred. It's a door we kicked in and then rehung as an archway on purpose to let the light through. We went inside. We turned off the porch light. The house kept doing its slow, holy job. And in the dark, shoulder to shoulder with the man I'd chosen twice, once in catastrophe and once in competence, I fell asleep inside the quiet we'd built, which is to say, inside the only kind of triumph I trust.